In these weeks leading up to Easter, we're spending some weeks looking at Luke's account of Jesus' trial and then of his crucifixion. And it's all leading up to our celebration of his resurrection in 2 weeks on Easter Sunday. And again, this is something that a lot of churches will do on a regular basis, taking this season before Easter and spending some time focusing on Jesus' suffering as a way of preparing our hearts and our minds for the meaning and celebration of Friday and then of Easter Sunday. And now this morning, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 23, verses 26 through 43. And what we're going to see is these verses aren't primarily focused in on an image of Jesus on the cross. They're primarily focused in on the people who saw Jesus on the cross and what they witnessed and how they responded. And I think you're going to see that, there's some incredible things to discover here. It's just been fun to be able to kind of unpack this throughout this past week. So let me encourage you, if you have your Bible, to open it to Luke 23. And we always want to encourage you to keep your Bible open so you could follow along with us as we dig into the passage through the message. But let me begin by reading the verses we're going to be studying. Luke 23, starting in 26. And they led him away, and they seized one Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. And there followed him a great multitude of the people and women who were mourning and lamenting for him. But turning to them, Jesus said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed.' For then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" 2 others who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified him and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." And they cast lots to divide his garments. And the people stood by watching, but the ruler scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Christ of God, his chosen one." And the soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, saying, "If you are the King of the Jews, save yourselves." And there was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." And he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." May God bless the reading of his word. Let me pray. Father, I thank you for the privilege that we do have to come together this morning, Father, to be able to dive into this passage. I thank you for the things that you're teaching me. And Father, for the beauty of what's here, I pray that you would now speak through me and in spite of me. Father, I pray that your spirit would be here. Father, that it would be your spirit that would speak. And Father, that each one of us that would have hearts that are open to not only understand, but also, Father, to apply whatever you were saying to us in our lives. I pray for your blessing now on this time. In Jesus' name, amen. In the spring of 2004, one of the most controversial movies of the time was released. It was Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. And it sought to tell the story of Jesus' death and suffering on the cross in a graphic depiction of it all. All the suffering, all the torture that he went through. It was controversial for a number of reasons, but probably most significantly because it clearly earned its R rating because of the graphic and bloody portrayal of Jesus' death. Now, it was interesting to see how people, both Christians and non-Christians, reacted to the movie. For Christians, some rejected it for various reasons, and others, many churches actually really encourage people not only to go, but to even bring unbelieving friends to it as a means of sharing the gospel. Now, if you didn't see the movie, it was incredibly moving. I don't know anyone that would say that it was enjoyable, but it was very moving to see such a explicit presentation of Jesus' beating and suffering. When the movie was showing in theaters, I remember talking to some members at our church, and they'd talk about how powerful it was. And I heard more than one person say, well, nobody could see that movie and not walk away being totally moved and deeper understanding who Jesus was and why he came. But I've got to say that in practice, I heard that sentiment, but that wasn't the way that it always worked out. Because in practice, I knew many non-Christians who saw the movie and walked away not moved toward the gospel. In fact, there were many who saw it and came away, some offended, some more hostility and criticizing it. And it made me wonder, okay, is the movie Like a Passion a good evangelistic tool? And as I thought about that, and I studied this passage this past week, I actually realized the answer is in the Gospels themselves. You see, because when I studied and reflected on Luke's account of Jesus' crucifixion these past weeks, I've been reminded of an important point. The Bible tells us that there were large numbers of people who saw Jesus' actual crucifixion. And many of those people were people that had seen Jesus prior to that. They had heard his teaching. They had seen him do miracles. They had seen his compassion and his love. But yet when they saw his suffering, most were not drawn towards him by what they saw. Most actually became more hostile. In that large crowd, there were only a handful of people that actually saw it and understood, who saw what Jesus went through and walked away as believers. And it reminded me of a basic principle, and it's just simply this. The vital thing isn't our knowledge or even our feelings about the cross. And that's maybe where the Passion really focused. Okay, here's what actually happened. And it was meant to be very emotional. It was very moving to see it happen. But it's not just what we know. It's not just even our feelings. The vital thing is our response to Jesus' death on the cross. And so what we're going to do this morning is we're going to look at the stories of several people who were actually there. People that witnessed firsthand the horror of Jesus' death on the cross. And the stories of these people, we're going to see that they all saw the same thing, but yet they walked away with different perspectives. And we're going to see 4 very different responses to what they saw. The first story I want to focus on is in verse 26, a guy named Simon of Cyrene. In the biblical account, it appears that he was first drawn into the story of Jesus as an unwitting victim. Now, let me show you what I mean here. Look at his story in verse 26 of Luke 23. And they led him away, and they seized one Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. What we're going to see is when we look at this guy, his experience was a life-changing perception in the face of an unexpected crisis. Now, let me explain that. Here's what's happening. Jesus had been condemned by Pilate in the center of Jerusalem, in the temple or the palace there. And it was the normal practice for the Romans not to carry out their executions in the city, but in a very public place outside of the city. Their goal was not just to punish those that were wrongdoers, but they did it in a very public way because they wanted to deter the general population away from any crime or any attempts to stand against Roman power. They wanted to show everyone the fate of those who would disobey the law. So Jesus, like any person who would be crucified, was given his cross to then carry to the place of execution. It was on a hill that was, that you could see from the city. And as with everyone else, they would then be driven through the city up to that hill, and they would try to make the march as public as possible. It was almost like this grotesque parade with a goal of shaming and torturing the condemned and drawing as much attention to the punishment as possible. Now, to understand exactly what happens here, we need to remember that Jesus has been up all night. He hasn't slept at all. They arrested him late in the night. He then was shuttled between 5 different trials. Throughout those trials, he's been mocked, he's been beaten, he's been whipped to an inch of his life. It actually would be very uncommon for a prisoner to be crucified to be whipped. It literally was overkill. But Pilate was hoping to set Jesus free. So he thought, well, let me whip him and then hope that's enough. But the religious leaders called for Jesus' death, and Pilate capitulated. So as he now then takes his cross and begins to march up to this place of execution, Jesus is already exhausted, physically depleted. He's lost an incredible amount of blood. And so as he tries to carry his cross, he doesn't have the physical strength to do it. And repeatedly he stumbles and he falls. And each time that he falls, the weight of the cross would dig his knees into the cobblestone streets, making it even harder to walk. Each time that he fell, the soldiers would push him up and force him to try to take his cross further. But finally it becomes obvious that Jesus isn't going to make it all the way to the place of execution. And so what the soldiers did then is they took what's their right of requisitioning people or making demands on the people. And so they go out and at random, they just pick a guy out of the crowd and they force him to carry Jesus' cross all the way up the hill. Now, if you think about that, this would have been a terrible thing for the guy that's chosen to do this, the unlucky guy that's just chosen out of the crowd. He's sitting there and suddenly he's pulled out and he's told that he's got to carry this heavy cross that's now filled with sweat, with blood, with gore, and he's got to be part of this grotesque parade that goes through the city streets up to the place of execution. And the people that are watching it, they don't know that this guy is innocent. He's just part of this parade. And the abuse that would be given towards people, he's likely receiving that as well. Now, Luke tells us that the man that was chosen for this was a guy named Simon from a place called Cyrene. And we don't know where that is, so let me tell you. Cyrene is in what is now Libya. It's North Africa. It's west of Egypt. So it's hundreds of miles from Jerusalem. And so, we don't know a lot necessarily about Simon, but from even this, there's certain things that we can deduce. First of all, he was almost certainly a Jew who had come to Jerusalem for the Passover. That was a tradition for many, many Jews. It was a custom. And not only that, but since he's from Africa, he doesn't live in Jerusalem, he probably knows nothing about Jesus and his ministry. He hasn't been in Jerusalem. He hasn't heard him. And so he's just walking in. In fact, Luke verse 26 tells us that he hadn't even been in the city. He was on his way back from the country, and he's just happening to pass by. And he stops to see the commotion. Suddenly he's grabbed by a soldier, and he's made to carry Jesus' cross. Now, to really understand, now we could just read this and go over it, but there's significance here. And to see the significance of Simon's story, we have to slow down and look a little more deeper. And we've got to see that there's a couple questions in his story. So one of the rules for interpreting the Bible is that we should notice the parts that seem out of place, the parts that are unusual. It's God's way of highlighting. And in Luke 26, 26 here, the first question that should pop out at us is that why does Luke, not only Luke, the other gospel writers, why does he mention Simon by name? Now you'd think, well, what's his name? Well, think about this for a minute. Who else in the story is named? Nobody else is. I mean, we don't have the name of the guards. We don't have the name of the criminals that are crucified with Jesus. We don't have the name of the women that we just read about. We don't have the name of the Roman centurion that's there at the foot of the cross declaring Jesus innocent. None of those people are named. And so the fact that Luke mentions his name is really unusual. Why? Because when you tell a story, you don't mention the name unless people would know who they are. Well, think about it practically. Okay, let's say, if I saw you on Wednesday and I said, hey, I was at the mall yesterday and I saw it's Jose Ramirez. I saw Nick Chubb. You'd be like, oh, wow, that's really neat. If you don't know sports, I saw Mike DeWine. It's like, okay, that'd be cool. Now, what if I saw you and I say, hey, I was at the mall yesterday and I ran into Bob Jackson? And you'd be like, Bob Jackson, who's that? I don't know. He's just a guy I met at the mall. He's got a couple kids. You'd be like, so then why are you telling me that? What's the purpose? You don't just mention strange names out of nowhere. It makes no sense. So let's apply that here to Luke 23. Why in the world does Luke mention this guy Simon of Cyrene by name? The only logical reason would be if there's people in the original audience who knew who he was. Now, to make that more clear, let's go to Mark. Mark, likewise, is a gospel. It gives us the same account. Most people believe that, actually we know it's actually in the end of Mark, that it was originally written to the believers in Rome. So in Mark 15:21, same part of the story, he adds another little detail. And they compelled the passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. Now, why would you mention his kids? That's even more. Here's Bob Jackson. It makes no sense. And every commentator who studies this says that the only way it makes sense is if Mark knows that the believers in the Roman church know these people. So what he's saying is, and they grabbed this guy, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Those guys in your church who are part of your, they're part of some of your leadership. And see, because unless they knew who these people were, it would make no sense at all to put these names in there. So when Luke are writing these gospels, at least the sons of Simon were still alive. prominent leaders in the church. In fact, let's go to Romans. In Romans 16, Paul ends his letter and he greets people. And look what he says in verse 13. Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, also his mother, who has been a mother to him as well. I think that's the same guy. So when Paul wrote his letter, it's not only that Simon's son was alive, but so was Simon's wife. She had been an encouragement to Paul. These were all leaders in the church. Now think about this. It's extremely unlikely that Simon's wife, his sons, were all prominent leaders in the church, that his father carried the cross for Jesus, and he didn't become a believer as well. In fact, what we actually see through this, it's almost certain that what happened is that Simon actually not only became a believer, he became a leader in the church, and he raised up his family, so they became leaders of the church. At first, he's just passing by. They're grabbing someone off the street, and reluctantly, he's made to carry the cross. But he witnessed what happened there, the behavior of Jesus and his words, and they leave such an impression that he becomes a follower of Jesus. In other words, this terrible task which Simon seemed pulled into turned out to be an incredible blessing for himself, for his family, for many others. That what seemed to be just a victim of fate was actually God putting him in exactly where he needed to be. So that actually raises another question. This one not necessarily here from Luke, but from what we just read in Romans. And that is, Simon was chosen, but who was he chosen by? And you might think, well, it's obvious. I mean, he's sitting on the road, and these Roman soldiers come and choose him at random, and they pull him in and force him to carry Jesus' cross. But let me go back again to Romans 16:13. Here's what you need to remember, is that Paul is giving all these greetings to all these people that he knew in the Roman church. And he gives all these greetings, and in that context, we read here that he says, greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, also his mother, who has been a mother to me as well. Now, what's significant, out of all the greetings, no one else does he say chosen in the Lord. That's distinctive just to this one guy. So why, out of everyone, does he say Rufus is the one who's chosen of the Lord? And let me suggest, I think it's because he's looking back to the story of Rufus's dad, of Simon. How Simon was chosen to carry Jesus' cross. And at the time, it felt like he was the victim of bad timing and the abuse of power of the Roman government. Why did the soldiers pick him? But in reality, it was God choosing. God was behind this. This is painting a picture of God's sovereignty and plan that is amazing. What at the time seemed to be a terrible event where he seemed to be the victim of Roman abuse, in reality was Jesus actually at that time superintending things so that he chose Simon for an event that would transform his life and transform the lives of his family. What seemed at first to be this terrible thing was God's perfect plan. And my friends, we need to realize that God still works in unexpected ways through events that often seem to us to be tragedies. And I reflect back at over 30 years of being a pastor, and I've been with countless people that have gone through periods of crisis. And I can say that any unexpected crisis will always move a person spiritually. Some people will go through the crisis and will move them away from God. God will get angry at God. How could God allow this? And where they'll define their life by the crisis and they'll walk away. But others see the crisis and it forces you to see your need. It forces you to depend on God in a different way. And part of that is saying, God, I want to believe that you're behind this. Now, for some here, if you're going through a difficult season in this time of life, if you feel like you're the victim of other people's abusive behavior, if you're struggling in the midst of a crisis, let me encourage you this Easter season, look at Simon. Look at this guy that went through this crisis, and God was saying, no, that's my way of choosing you. And it was his way of then seeing what God was doing, and God used it for his growth and his glory. Is it possible that God's doing that in your life as well? And that's the first story. The second story, the second perspective is the women of Jerusalem. In verse 27, and he tells us, and there followed a great multitude of the people and of women who were mourning and lamenting for him. So here's this picture. The people are marching Jesus through the streets. There's a crowd there that's following him, some friends, some enemies. But part of that crowd is specifically a group of women who are mourning, who are wailing for Jesus. And we're not sure who they were. Probably some of these were people that had heard Jesus teach before. It's not speaking of Mary and Mary Magdalene. It's speaking of people that were not as close as followers. But they're caught up in the emotion of the event. They're mourning Jesus. And so what we see here is they have deeply felt emotion but without personal application. And because they don't get it, Jesus challenges them. Now, here's where I want you to look at your Bible again. Now, just imagine this picture. Jesus is going through the streets. He's beaten, he's bruised. These women are showing compassion for him. They're mourning for him. They're weeping for him. And then he turns to them and he speaks to them. Now, what do you expect him to say? I mean, I expect him to say, yeah, it's like, man, thank you for your concern, or this is for you. I want you to know that I love you. I'm going to expect something. But we wouldn't expect what he says. Look what he says. Look at verse 27. He says, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. And you're like, what in the world? I mean, I think about the women. He turns and he looks at them and you're like, what? What in the world is he saying here? It's an unusual response. Actually, he's speaking, first of all, about a prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem. And then he quotes Hosea 10:8, which is a passage that was a prophecy about the final judgment of God upon sin. And when he's saying, don't weep for me, he's not saying that, you shouldn't look at what's going on and cry when you reflect on Jesus' death. He's saying, if you're just crying for me, you don't understand what's going on. You're weeping for me because you see a good and innocent man who's been beaten and condemned to a terrible death. And you see me going to my death, but you don't understand this is all about God's judgment on sin. And you too are under a sentence of death, and the sentence hangs over you. He warns people, if you don't understand this, then one day the judgment of the Father will come upon you. It's all about the judgment of sin. And unless you understand what I'm doing and that I'm taking God's judgment of sin, you won't be ready for the last day of judgment. And one day that you're going to face a fate that is as bad as what you see me going through right now. He's saying until you understand your own danger, that you're under the sentence of God's punishment, and that every person is, unless you understand what I'm doing, until you, in a sense, he comes back and he says, until you weep for yourselves, you cannot weep for me properly. Until you understand your own need, you cannot understand what I'm doing. He's saying we cannot understand the cross until we understand the reality of God's judgment on sin. The cross was about Jesus willingly taking upon himself God's judgment against the sin we deserved, the punishment we deserved, so that by his sacrifice we would be forgiven. And the Bible teaches that his physical suffering on the cross was just an image of the greater spiritual suffering that he took upon himself when he faced God's wrath for our sin. And if we don't understand that, if we don't understand the true nature of the cross, then we can't properly weep for Jesus. You see, it wasn't just that Jesus was an innocent victim of horrific tragedy. We've got to understand that, no, he was taking the punishment we deserved. And when we look at that, what we're going to realize is that we're going to be amazed then at the price that Jesus paid for our sins. And at the same time, we need to be warned, if we don't understand that, it's a warning for us of the price that we will have to pay apart from God's grace. That's what Jesus means when he says in verse 31, this kind of, again, this weird statement, for if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it's dry? It's like, what in the world does that mean? Well, here's the idea. He's saying green wood isn't supposed to burn. If you try to light a fire with green wood, you're not going to do very well. But that's meant for dry, dead wood. Even I understand that. I'm not very good, but even I understand that. But if the fire is so hot that it burns the green wood, what does that fire say for the dry wood? And the green wood is Jesus. And he's saying, okay, you've got to understand, that here I am and I'm the innocent one. Jesus is the sinless Son of God. And if God's punishment does this to me, then what's going to happen if you're the dry dead wood, if you're the unbeliever who rejects God? See, it's a warning. Now, I want to acknowledge that when I talk about this idea of warning against God's wrath and his judgment, that's pretty unpopular today. We don't like to talk about those things. But here's what we need to realize, is that this is Jesus saying this. People will come and say, no, we want to talk about Jesus' love. And well, here you have Jesus walking toward the cross, his greatest expression of love. And he turns and he says to people who have compassion on him, no, you need to understand this is a warning of God's judgment on you unless you believe in what I'm doing. Only if you understand that you deserve, that I deserve, each one of us deserve God's wrath, only then can we understand that what Jesus did at the cross, the price that he paid for us, that expression of love. So have you done that? Have you looked and you just moved, or have you said, God, I know I need that and I accept what Jesus did for me, for my forgiveness? Now, I know even some people will say, well, that's not very loving, and it's, Easter, and we should be talking about, Jesus' resurrection and happy and encouraging. But here's what you've got to realize. Jesus speaks and warns against judgment. And it's actually a loving thing to do. Why? Because the reality is if we die apart from a relationship with Christ, if we die in our own sins, then the fact is we will face God's wrath. There is a reality of a fire that if it will burn the green wood, it will destroy us. And it's loving to warn. Think of it this way. If you come home and it's 11 o'clock at night and you see your neighbor's house and you see through the windows there's fire that's going on inside the house, is it loving to go wake them up and to tell them about the fire? What if you have somebody come and say, well, I don't want to wake them up. They're probably sleeping. They'll be grouchy if I wake them up. And if I wake them about the fire, I'm kind of implying that something is broken in their house. They might be offended by that. No, you don't do that. You're like, you're going to die. Wake up. You pound on the door. And what we need to realize is that God is saying there is a spiritual reality of fire before God. And the loving thing to do, Jesus tells us the loving thing to do is to speak that truth as a warning, because it's an invitation to Jesus Christ. Now that's the second perspective. The third perspective is probably the biggest group. It's the crowd, the majority of the crowd that's there, but also the first criminal that we speak of. We see the crowd in verse 35, and the people stood by watching, but the ruler scoffed at him, saying, he saved others, let him save himself. If he is the Christ of God, his chosen one. And the soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, if you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. And then we see a similar response from one of the criminals in 39. One of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us. All of them are saying, if you are truly the Messiah, if you have power, then prove it. Prove it by saving yourself. Use your power the way that we expect it. They demanded physical results to prove Jesus' spiritual authority. You see, pretty much here, everyone's mocking Jesus. And they're mocking him based on the idea, you claim to be a king, but if you're a king, kings have power. Show your power. They couldn't understand a king that would come in weakness. They couldn't understand a king who would choose to show his power by offering himself as a sacrifice for others. And then in verse 39, we see that one of the criminals is joining on what everyone else is saying. Prove it by your power. But he adds, if you're the Christ, save yourself and us. You see, when I read that, I think that's a prayer that all of us at some point in time have really prayed. The fact of the matter is, all of us have been in a time where we go through some kind of crisis. We have some threat to our lives, some threat to our kids, or something goes wrong. And we say, God, if you're there, then show it, prove it, fix the problem. In fact, there are many skeptics, maybe some here, that you're skeptical about God because you prayed that prayer and he didn't answer it. The fact is, you even see in this passage, he doesn't respond to all the people saying this. He doesn't respond to the first. Jesus doesn't answer the question at all. Now, what's the problem? Is when we do this, there's a premise that's saying, I know how my life should go. And if there's a God, then he knows how my life should go. And therefore, if he isn't making my life go the right way, the way I expect it, either he's not loving or there's no God. Now, the problem with that is the premise of saying in the beginning, I know how my life should go. The fact of the matter is we think we know the way we want it to go, but there are times that God will allow us to go through things that are not what we would choose. In fact, even in the story, look at Simon, the guy that's on the side of the street that's chosen and made to carry the cross. He didn't choose that. That's not what he thought was good, but yet it was God's choice for him. Something that seemed bad was actually something that was very good. And even when you look at the people here, it's not only the soldier, it's the political leaders and the religious leaders. And they were all saying, if you're a king, why? Because they expected Jesus to be a political Messiah. You get rid of the Romans, put us in charge. And if you're not going to do it, how can we believe in you? My friends, there are still many today who cry out to God and saying, God, if you prove it, then if you're God, then prove it. Do what I demand. And if you didn't do it, then how can I believe in you? But the heart behind this is what the religious leaders were saying, what that first criminal was saying. God, I know what's best, and you're here to serve me. I'm God, you're here to serve what I demand. That's not the attitude of Simon. It's not the attitude of this last person we're looking at. The second criminal, the man who is being crucified, but yet somehow found life looking at the cross of Jesus. Look at his perspective in verse 40. And the other criminal rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since we are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due rewards of our deeds. This man has done nothing wrong." And he said to Jesus, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." This is a man who recognized his spiritual need, and he submitted to Jesus Christ's provision. I mean, think about even his request in verse 42. "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Where are they? They're all being crucified. Jesus is being mocked. What kingdom? Does this look like Jesus is coming into a kingdom? But yet, this man was able to see the true nature of the kingdom. Everyone else is looking at it and saying, this isn't a king. This isn't a king that lets these things happen. And he's able to see something that there's a power, there's a nature of a kingdom, there's a nature of good news. You know, what's interesting is both Mark and Matthew's account tell us that initially both of the criminals mocked Jesus. However, something happened in the course of the day that caused this one guy to change his heart and mind. And you say, what brought about the change? And again, the text tells us. It tells us in verse 34 that it says that Jesus called out, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." Now, first of all, I'm going to tell you, without getting into detail, this is clearly the center of this whole section. This is the highlighted section. And one of the places that you would see this is think of it this way. We're told Jesus had put on the cross and he says, "Father, forgive them." And then after that, we have all the description of everybody mocking him and beating him and doing all these things. Why don't we have the description of their bad behavior and then Jesus forgives them? I think there's a couple reasons. Number one, it's telling us this is the center. But it's also telling us not only of Jesus' offer of grace and forgiveness, but it's drawing our attention to the response of the people who heard that offer. You see, the question is, how did they respond? Not only what they saw on the cross, but what they heard of Jesus' grace. As they were spewing words of hatred and abuse, that Jesus looked at them and said, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." Most continued to reject him because it wasn't the demonstration of power they expected. But the second criminal was transformed by what he heard. Again, remember the context. Jesus is speaking words of grace and forgiveness as everyone else is speaking words of condemnation and mockery. And think about it this way. They're mocking Jesus. Who are these two guys that are next to him? They're criminals who deserve to be crucified. What do you think everybody's saying to them? They're not speaking words of grace. Oh, they're not. The people aren't crying for them. They're being mocked as well. And Jesus looks at this man who is up there, who's suffering, who's being crucified, and who shortly ago was mocking Jesus himself. And he's hearing everyone else mock. And he turns to him, this man who is guilty, and speaks not words of condemnation, judgment, you deserve this, but looks at him and says, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." See, all others rejected Jesus because he failed to show the power they expected in the Messiah. This guy saw in Jesus a power that he had never seen before, an incredible power, the power to forgive. The power that was there to look at all those that were unjustly crucifying him and beating him and mocking him, and to speak words of forgiveness. That's the power of God. This is a man who looked at that and said, if that's a kingdom, I want to be a part of that kind of kingdom. Because I've seen the Roman kingdom, I've seen these religious leaders, I've seen other people's power, but this is a kind of power I've never seen before. This is a kind of power, this is real. The first guy said, Jesus, if you're king, save yourself and save us. And because what I need is a different situation. The second guy looks at it and says, no, I deserve where I'm at. What I need isn't to be given, off the cross. What I need is to be forgiven. What I need is a king that will love me, a king that doesn't use his power to take advantage of me, but a king that uses his power to sacrifice himself for me. See, and here's what you need to realize is that this is an invitation to each one of us. Where are we? How did this guy respond? Well, the first thing he did is he acknowledged his guilt before God. He understood it. He acknowledged it. What does he say? He said, don't mock this guy. We're here because we deserve it. It's not only that he felt bad. I'm being punished justly. If I were to die, I deserve, I'm getting what I deserve. And as Jesus spoke that warning to the women, it's like suddenly he realizes that's true of me too. He heard that warning. He was going up there with him. That's what I deserve. But Jesus, if you're the green wood, you're taking it for me, and I ask you to now take my wrath, what I deserve, so that I would be forgiven. See, he acknowledges his guilt. He asks for forgiveness, and then he boldly trusts in Jesus' grace. In verse 42, he's on the cross next to Jesus, and he says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And again, this is an incredible request. Think about it. Here you have him basically saying, okay, Jesus, I look at that and I believe who you say you are. I believe you are the king. I believe that you have a kingdom, a different kind of kingdom. And wherever you're going after this, whatever kingdom you come to and whatever reward you come into, will you stop and remember me, this guy that's been hanging on the cross with you for the last 30 minutes, who's done nothing worthy in my life other than being guilty of being executed for murder and treason that I'm guilty of. Jesus, remember me. And you know what's even more amazing? Jesus turns to him and says, truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. And Jesus speaks words of grace and forgiveness, not based at all in anything that he has done and anything that he deserved, but based on the fact that Jesus Christ took his sins, took the wrath of God for him. And he said, if you understand this, and if you ask me to forgive you, today you are forgiven. Today you will be with me in paradise. My friends, that's the gospel. That's what we're talking about. In a moment, we're going to take communion. And what is communion? We're going to take bread. We're going to take wine. And it's, in a sense, saying these images that God calls us to do as part of our service, to hold them up and say, look at the cross again. Look, go back there and look at what Jesus did. Look what he did at the cross. His body was broken. His blood was spilled for you, for me. You see, and the question isn't just, do you know about it or how you feel about it? It's what's your response to it? What's your response? Or Jesus, you need to do this, or or do we go and we look at it like Simon of Cyrene, this man who literally now, out of expected crisis, carrying Jesus' cross, he is physically covered in the blood of Jesus and understood that's what he needed, and his life was changed. Are we like that thief where, man, I haven't done anything, man, I've walked away from God and God would reject me, but he understood that no, Jesus took all the rejection. So that all we have to do is to say, Jesus, remember me today. I ask you for the forgiveness of my sins. I not only remember what happened, but I accept it. I ask you to be my Savior, my Lord. And if we do that, through our faith in what Jesus has done, we are forgiven and we are made his child.
If you have a question about the message, Community Church, or Jesus Christ, send us a text to 330-400-3242. You can learn more about our events and community groups at ccpl.life/connect. There you can also send in a prayer request. We would love to pray for you. Have a blessed Lord's Day, and we'll see you on Sunday.